"You're not planning to go to the Lighthouse, are you, Lily?" said Mrs. Ramsay. "Remember poor Mr. Langley? He had been round the world dozens of times, but he told me he never suffered as he did when my husband took him there. Are you a good sailor, Mr. Tansley?" she asked. Mr. Tansley raised a hammer, swung it high in air, but realizing as it descended that he could not smite that butterfly with such an instrument as this, said only that he had never been sick in his life. But in that one sentence lay compact, like gunpowder, that his grandfather was a fisherman, his father a chemist, that he had worked his way up entirely himself, that he was proud of it, that he was Charles Tansley, a fact that nobody there seemed to realize, but one of these days every single person would know it. He scowled ahead of him. He could almost pity these mild, cultivated people who would be blown sky high like bales of wool and barrels of apples one of these days by the gunpowder that was in him. "Will you take me, Mr. Tansley?" said Lily quickly, kindly. For, of course, if Mrs. Ramsay said to her, as in effect she did, "I am drowning, my dear, in seas of fire. Unless you apply some balm to the anguish of this hour and say something nice to that young man there, life will run upon the rocks. Indeed, I hear the grating and the growling at this minute. My nerves are taut as fiddle strings. Another touch and they will snap." When Mrs. Ramsay said all this, as the glance in her eyes said it, of course, for the 150th time Lily Briscoe had to renounce the experiment. What happens if one is not nice to that young man there? And be nice. Judging the turn in her mood correctly, that she was friendly to him now, he was relieved of his egotism, and told her how he had been thrown out of a boat when he was a baby, how his father used to fish him out with a boat hook. That was how he had learned to swim. One of his uncles kept the light on some rock or other off the Scottish coast, he said. He had been there with him in a storm. This was said loudly in a pause. They had to listen to him when he said that he had been with his uncle in a lighthouse in a storm. Ah, thought Lily Briscoe as the conversation took this auspicious turn, and she felt Mrs. Ramsay's gratitude, for Mrs. Ramsay was free now to talk for a moment herself. Ah, she thought, but what haven't I paid to get it for you? She had not been sincere. She had done the usual trick, been nice. She would never know him, he would never know her. Human relations were all like that, she thought, and the worst, if it had not been for Mr. Banks, were between men and women. Inevitably, these were extremely insincere. Then her eye caught the salt cellar, which she had placed there to remind her, and she remembered that next morning she would move the tree further towards the middle. And her spirits rose so high at the thought of painting tomorrow that she laughed out loud at what Mr. Tansley was saying. Let him talk all night, if he liked it. "But how long do they leave men on a lighthouse?" she asked. He told her. He was amazingly well informed, and as he was grateful, and as he liked her, and as he was beginning to enjoy himself, so now Mrs. Ramsay thought she could return to that dreamland, that unreal but fascinating place, the Mannings' drawing room at Marlow 20 years ago, where one moved about without haste or anxiety, for there was no future to worry about. She knew what had happened to them, what to her. It was like reading a good book again, for she knew the end of that story since it had happened 20 years ago, and life, which shot down even from this dining room table in Cascades, heaven knows where, was sealed up there, and lay like a lake placidly between its banks. He said they had built a billiard room. Was it possible? Would William go on talking about the Mannings? She wanted him to. But no, For some reason he was no longer in the mood. She tried. He did not respond. She could not force him. She was disappointed. "The children are disgraceful," she said, sighing. He said something about punctuality being one of the minor virtues which do not acquire until later in life. "If at all," said Mrs. Ramsay, merely to fill up space, thinking what an old maid William was becoming. Conscious of his treachery, conscious of her wish to talk about something more intimate, yet out of mood for it at present, he felt come over him the disagreeableness of life, sitting there, waiting. Perhaps the others were saying something interesting. What were they saying? That the fishing season was bad, that the men were emigrating. They were talking about wages and unemployment. The young man was abusing the government. William Banks, thinking what a relief it was to catch on to something of this sort when private life was disagreeable, heard him say something about one of the most scandalous acts of the present government. Lily was listening. Mrs. Ramsay was listening. They were all listening. But already bored, Lily felt that something was lacking. Mr. Banks felt that something was lacking. Pulling a shawl round her, Mrs. Ramsay felt that something was lacking. All of them, bending themselves to listen, thought, "Pray heaven that the inside of my mind may not be exposed," for each thought, "The others are feeling this. The others are outraged and indignant with the government about the fishermen, whereas I feel nothing at all." But perhaps, thought Mr. Banks, as he looked at Mr. Tansley, here is the man. One was always waiting for the man. There was always a chance. At any moment the leader might arise, the man of genius, in politics as in anything else. Probably he will be extremely disagreeable to us old fogies, thought Mr. Banks, doing his best to make allowances. For he knew, by some curious physical sensation, as of nerves erect in his spine, that he was jealous, for himself partly more probably for his work, for his point of view, for his science, and therefore he was not entirely open-minded or altogether fair, for Mr. Tansley seemed to be saying, "You have wasted your lives, you are all of you wrong. Poor old fogies, you're hopelessly behind the times." He seemed to be rather cocksure, this young man, and his manners were bad. But Mr. Banks bade himself observe. He had courage. He had ability. He was extremely well up in the facts. Probably, Mr. Banks thought, as Tansley abused the government, there is a good deal in what he says. "Tell me now," he said. So they argued about politics, and Lily looked at the leaf on the tablecloth. And Mrs. Ramsay, leaving the argument entirely in the hands of the two men, wondered why she was so bored by this talk, and wished, looking at her husband at the other end of the table, that he would say something. One word, she said to herself, for if he said a thing, it would make all the difference. He went to the heart of things. He cared about fishermen and their wages. He could not sleep for thinking of them. It was altogether different when he spoke. One did not feel then, "Pray heaven you don't see how little I care," because one did care. Then, realizing that it was because she admired him so much that she was waiting for him to speak, she felt as if somebody had been praising her husband to her and their marriage, and she glowed all over, without realizing that it was she herself who had praised him. She looked at him, thinking to find this shown in his face. He would be looking magnificent, but not in the least. He was screwing his face up. He was scowling and frowning and flushing with anger. What on earth was it about? She wondered. What could be the matter? Only that poor old Augustus had asked for another plate of soup, that was all. It was unthinkable, it was detestable, so he signaled to her across the table that Augustus should be beginning his soup over again. He loathed people eating when he had finished. She saw his anger fly like a pack of hounds into his eyes, his brow, and she knew that in a moment something violent would explode, and then, but thank goodness, she saw him clutch himself and clap a brake on the wheel, and the whole of his body seemed to emit sparks but not words. He sat there, scowling. He had said nothing, he would have her observe. Let her give him the credit for that. But why, after all, should poor Augustus not ask for another plate of soup? He had merely touched Ellen's arm and said, Ellen, please, another plate of soup. And then Mr. Ramsay scowled like that. And why not? Mrs. Ramsay demanded. Surely they could let Augustus have his soup if he wanted it. He hated people wallowing in food. Mr. Ramsay frowned at her. He hated everything dragging on for hours like this. But he had controlled himself, Mr. Ramsay would have her observe, disgusting though the sight was. But why show it so plainly? Mrs. Ramsay demanded. They looked at each other down the long table, sending these questions and answers across, each knowing exactly what the other felt. Everybody could see, Mrs. Ramsay thought. There was Rose gazing at her father. There was Roger gazing at his father. Both would be off in spasms of laughter in another second, she knew, and so she said promptly, indeed it was time, light the candles. And they jumped up instantly and went and fumbled at the sideboard. Why could he never conceal his feelings, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, and she wondered if Augustus Carmichael had noticed. Perhaps he had, perhaps he had not. She could not help respecting the composure with which he sat there drinking his soup. If he wanted soup, he asked for soup. Whether people laughed at him or were angry with him, he was the same. He did not like her, she knew that, but partly for that very reason she respected him. And looking at him drinking soup, very large and calm in the failing light, and monumental and contemplative, she wondered what he did feel then, and why he was always content and dignified. And she thought how devoted he was to Andrew, and would call him into his room, and Andrew said, show him things. And there he would lie all day long on the lawn, brooding, presumably over his poetry, till he reminded one of a cat watching birds. And then he clapped his paws together when he had found the word. And her husband said, poor old Augustus, he's a true poet, which was high praise from her husband. Now 8 candles were stood down the table, and after the first stoop the flames stood upright and drew with them into visibility the long table entire, and in the middle a yellow and purple dish of fruit. What had she done with it, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, for Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny pink-lined shell, of the bananas, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. Thus brought up suddenly into the light, it seemed possessed of great size and depth, was like a world in which one could take one's staff and climb up hills, she thought, and go down into valleys, and to her pleasure, for it brought them into sympathy momentarily, she saw that Augustus too feasted his eyes on the same plate of fruit, plunged in, broke off a bloom here, a tassel there, and returned, after feasting, to his hive. That was his way of looking, different from hers, but looking together united them. Now all the candles were lit, and the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight, and composed, as they had not been in the twilight, into a party round a table, for the night was now shut off by panes of glass, which, far from giving any accurate view of the outside world, rippled it so strangely that here, inside the room, seemed to be order and dry land. There, outside, a reflection in which things wavered and vanished waterily. Some change at once went through them all, as if this had really happened, and they were all conscious of making a party together in a hollow on an island, had their common cause against that fluidity out there. Mrs. Ramsay, who had been uneasy waiting for Paul and Minter to come in, and unable, she felt, to settle to things, now felt her uneasiness changed to expectation. For now they must come. And Lily Briscoe, trying to analyze the cause of the sudden exhilaration, compared it with that moment on the tennis lawn, when solidity suddenly vanished and such vast spaces lay between them. And now the same effect was got by the many candles in the sparely furnished room, and the uncurtained windows, and the bright mask-like look of faces seen by candlelight. Some weight was taken off them. Anything might happen, she felt. They must come now, Mrs. Ramsay thought, looking at the door, and at that instant Minta Doyle, Paul Rayleigh, and a maid carrying a great dish in her hands came in together. They were awfully late. They were horribly late. They were horribly late, Minta said, as they found their way to different ends of the table. I lost my brooch. My grandmother's brooch, said Minta with a sound of lamentation in her voice, and a suffusion in her large brown eyes, looking down, looking up, as she sat by Mr. Ramsay, which roused his chivalry so that he bantered her. How could she be such a goose, he asked, as to scramble about the rocks in jewels? She was by way of being terrified of him. He was so fearfully clever, and the first night when she had sat by him, and he talked about George Eliot, she had been really frightened, for she had left the third volume of Middlemarch in the train, and she never knew what happened in the end. But afterwards she got on perfectly, and made herself out even more ignorant than she was, because he liked telling her she was a fool. And so tonight, directly he laughed at her, she was not frightened. Besides, she knew directly she came into the room that the miracle had happened. She wore her golden haze. Sometimes she had it, sometimes not. She never knew why it came or why it went, or if she had it until she came into the room, and then she knew instantly by the way some man looked at her. Yes, tonight she had it, tremendously. She knew that by the way Mr. Ramsay told her not to be a fool. She sat beside him, smiling. It must have happened then, thought Mrs. Ramsay. They are engaged. And for a moment she felt what she had never expected to feel again, jealousy. For he, her husband, felt it too, Minta's glow. He liked these girls, these golden reddish girls, with something flying, something a little wild and harum-scarum about them, who didn't scrape their hair off, weren't, as he said about poor Lily Briscoe, skimpy. There was some quality which she herself had not, some luster, some richness, which attracted him, amused him, led him to make favorites of girls like Minta. They might cut his hair for him, plait him watch change, or interrupt him at his work, hailing him. She heard them. Come along, Mr. Ramsay, it's our turn to beat them now, and out he came to play tennis. But indeed she was not jealous only now and then, when she made herself look in her glass a little resentful that she had grown old, perhaps by her own fault. The bill for the greenhouse and all the rest of it. She was grateful to them for laughing at him. How many pipes have you smoked today, Mr. Ramsay, and so on. Till he seemed a young man, a man very attractive to women, not burdened, not weighed down with the greatness of his labors and the sorrows of the world and his fame or his failure, but again as she had first known him, gaunt but gallant, helping her out of a boat, she remembered, with delightful ways. Like that, she looked at him, and he looked astonishingly young, teasing Minta. For herself, put it down there, she said, helping the Swiss girl to place gently before her the huge brown pot in which was the bœuf en daube. For her own part, she liked her boobies. Paul must sit by her. She had kept a place for him. Really, she sometimes thought she liked the boobies best. They did not bother one with their dissertations. How much they missed, after all, these very clever men. How dried up they did become, to be sure. There was something she thought as he sat down very charming about Paul. His manners were delightful to her, and his sharp-cut nose and his bright blue eyes. He was so considerate. Would he tell her, now that they were all talking again, what had happened? "We went back to look for Minta's brooch," he said, sitting down by her. "We." That was enough. She knew from the effort, the rise in his voice to surmount a difficult word, that it was the first time he had said, "We." We did this. We did that. They'll say that all their lives, she thought, and an exquisite scent of olives and oil and juice rose from the great brown dish as Marthe, with a little flourish, took the cover off. The cook had spent 3 days over that dish, and she must take great care, Mrs. Ramsay thought, diving into the soft mass, to choose a specially tender piece for William Banks. And she peered into the dish, with its shiny walls and its confusion of savory brown and yellow meats, and its bay leaves and its wine, and thought, this will celebrate the occasion. A curious sense rising in her, at once freakish and tender, of celebrating a festival, as if two emotions were called up in her, one profound, for what could be more serious than the love of man for woman, what more commanding, more impressive, bearing in its bosom the seeds of death? At the same time, these lovers, these people entering into illusion glittering-eyed, must be danced round with mockery, decorated with garlands. "It is a triumph," said Mr. Banks, laying his knife down for a moment. He had eaten attentively. It was rich, it was tender, it was perfectly cooked. How did she manage these things in the depths of the country, he asked her. She was a wonderful woman. All his love, all his reverence had returned, and she knew it. "It is a French recipe of my grandmother's," said Mrs. Ramsay, speaking with a ring of great pleasure in her voice. Of course, it was French. "What passes for cookery in England is an abomination," they agreed. "It is putting cabbages in water. It is roasting meat till it is like leather. It is cutting off the delicious skins of vegetables, in which," said Mr. Banks, "all the virtue of the vegetable is contained." "And the waste," said Mrs. Ramsay. "A whole French family could live on what an English cook throws away." Spurred on by her sense that William's affection had come back to her, and that everything was all right again, and that her suspense was over, and that now she was free both to triumph and to mock, she laughed, she gesticulated, till Lily thought how childlike, how absurd she was, sitting up there with all her beauty opened again in her, talking about the skins of vegetables. There was something frightening about her. She was irresistible. Always she got her own way in the end, Lily thought. Now she had brought this off. Paul and Minta, one might suppose, were engaged. Mr. Banks was dining here. She put a spell on them all by wishing, so simply, so directly. And Lily contrasted that abundance with her own poverty of spirit, and supposed that it was partly that belief, for her face was all lit up. Without looking young, she looked radiant. In this strange, this terrifying thing which made Paul Rayleigh the center of it, all of a tremor, yet abstract, absorbed, silent. Mrs. Ramsay, Lily felt as she talked about the skins of vegetables, exalted that, worshipped that, held her hands over it to warm them, to protect it, and yet, having brought it all about, somehow laughed, led her victims, Lily felt, to the altar. It came over her too now, the emotion, the vibration of love. How inconspicuous she felt her saved by Paul's side. He, glowing, burning. She, aloof, satirical. He, bound for adventure. She, moored to the shore. He, launched, incautious. She, solitary, left out. And ready to implore a share, if it were a disaster, in his disaster, she said shyly, "When did Minta lose her brooch?" He smiled, the most exquisite smile, veiled by memory, tinged by dreams. He shook his head. "On the beach," he said. "I'm going to find it," he said. "I'm getting up early." This being kept secret from Minta, he lowered his voice and turned his eyes to where she sat laughing beside Mr. Ramsay. Lily wanted to protest violently and outrageously her desire to help him, envisaging how in the dawn on the beach she would be the one to pounce on the brooch half hidden by some stone, and thus herself be included among the sailors and adventurers. But what did he reply to her offer? She actually said, with an emotion that she seldom let appear, "Let me come with you," and he laughed. He meant yes or no, either perhaps, but it was not his meaning. It was the odd chuckle he gave, as if he had said, "Throw yourself over the cliff if you like, I don't care." He turned on her cheek the heat of love, its horror, its cruelty, its unscrupulosity. It scorched her, and Lily, looking at Minta being charming to Mr. Ramsay at the other end of the table, flinched for her exposed to those fangs, and was thankful. For, at any rate, she said to herself, catching sight of the salt cellar on the pattern, she need not marry, thank heaven. She need not undergo that degradation. She was saved from that delusion. She would move the tree rather more to the middle.